On this episode, we are talking about Jennifer's Body, feminism, film trivia, grief, and much more. I'm Captain Nostalgia, and this is the Victims and Villains podcast, a podcast extension of the nonprofit that educates and engages individuals on mental health awareness and suicide prevention through pop culture. Buckle up, it's about to get bloody, weird, and yes, spoilers are ahead. Well, at this point, I should probably just give up being a movie buff and just listen to our guest for this one because she's 2 for 2 on recommendations that she's given me off air and sometimes even on air. I think we teased this episode like some point last year and it's finally here. So please help me in welcoming from the Boobies and Newbies podcast, Miss Kelly O'Reynolds.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be here. I'm always excited to be here, and we pick the best movies to discuss, so I'm thrilled yet again.
Except for Oklahoma.
That's right. They've all been uphill since Oklahoma.
True.
It's a good place to start.
Yeah. And that voice is a new staff writer and podcaster, Miss Abigail Bardwell.
Hello, thrilled to be here. Wonderful movie. I very much enjoyed watching this one.
So Kelly knows this, but I'll share this with our listeners. I had a tradition when I was a young adult, 18, 19, back when Blockbuster was still a thing, where I had a tradition Friday nights, I would go to Blockbuster, rent the latest releases, or like try and find like obscure horror movies, and I would get Chinese food. And then I ended up actually going into Rent Jennifer's Body, and I hated this movie the first time I saw it, and I am pleased to readdress this movie from a 2021 perspective, a more mature man that I am, and Kelly, thank you so much for spurring me on to give this a second chance.
You just weren't ready for her yet, and now you are. So I'm so glad that you gave it a second chance, because I feel like so many people wouldn't. So I appreciate the fact that you were willing to give it a second go.
So I think for me, my main issue with this, and I guess we can get into this now, is was
dive on in
how this movie was marketed. Like Megan Fox and the writer, the director, like so much of the crew has gone on just, since this movie is kind of, garnered a cult following by this point, 11 years later, 12 years, whatever, something like that.
We don't have to talk about that.
And they've talked about how this movie was, it was marketed to be this like super sexualized, like peak of Megan Fox and the Transformers movies and all this other stuff. And I think that with that in mind, like that's part of the reason I feel like probably as a younger man, I was like, I really hated this movie because I was marketed this movie and I got this movie, and this is now like a high esteem on my list for like horror movies. So but yeah, let's talk about like the marketing of this movie to begin with.
Yeah,
it was go for it, Abigail.
I love that this is like the premise of because this is my first take, my first deep dive into this one, and I was literally just talking with my fiance last night. I feel like if I had seen this when it first came out, I would have been like, "Nah, thanks. Like we're good. I'm full on that one." But because I watched it now, well, I'm not an older, wiser man, but older and wiser. I'm kind of same take. I literally wrote in my notes, if I had seen it when it came out, I would have hated this. But no, I love it. And I think the marketing had something to do with that.
So I remember seeing this movie in theaters with a couple of my girlfriends. And I think when it came to the marketing, it was very much like the women went to go see it because it was written by the same writer of Juno. And it was, it seemed like, oh, well, that was such a great movie about, what it means to be a young woman. Like this will be exciting. This will be another take. But I totally remember all the posters and the trailers and the marketing aspect of like, well, this is also going to be, look out, gentlemen, there's ladies kissing in this movie. Like there's going to be a lesbian romp. And this is what we're going to market to get the heterosexual male viewers to come see this movie. So it was very polarizing. It was very polarizing at the time.
Yeah. I wasn't a blockbuster person. I wasn't a movie person back then. Going to the character Needy, I was very much that character. It actually was more refreshing for me to see that character in the movie because I was just expecting to be like, accosted by Megan Fox's sexuality the entire time. Not that I was complaining about that at all, but it was nice to have that on the other side that I could like relate to.
Abigail, you put this in the notes, keeping with the release date and kind of the time in which this movie came out. It was released in 2009, and I think it just really fell on like deaf ears. But you had put in here about Megan Fox in 2018 talked about her involvement, her complaints, and just kind of with the Me Too movement. And I think that she did an interview with one of Shudder's podcasts, and she talked about how like over the years, like she's just kind of seen a rise in the support for Jennifer, as a character, and I think a large portion of that comes from things like Me Too coming, because a large portion of what makes this film so impactful is the journey that Jennifer takes in this movie.
I agree. I've read several thesis papers about this movie. I've read multiple articles addressing why is this not a bigger deal to everybody, like this movie, and also ones who have exemplified Jennifer's Body as like a new cult classic. And that's how I think of it. That's honestly how I've thought of it since 2009, because this is one of the most quotable movies of the last 10 years. And so I really do think, because I feel like if this had come out at a different time, it could have been better received. So, I mean, but you could say that about any movie too. So it's one of those ones where it's kind of cornered into a specific time where we were seeing, especially people like Megan Fox, being exploited and used like specifically just as like a sexual object on screen. And we didn't talk about it then. We're talking about it in hindsight, looking back on it. But it's interesting because it's one of those ones that I wish got more attention than it did.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I also, I fell into this rabbit hole of Google searches until like 3:00 in the morning, ended up also stumbling upon some research papers on this movie. And it really is quite fascinating how much they tucked in there, knowing the audience were basically like Twilight fans. And I mean, it really is true. It has so much of like this great undertone to it. It has a lot of really interesting, fascinating messages that people have gotten into, but it really just kind of got swept under the rug of like the emo kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of my favorite scenes, exploring the quote-unquote emo kid nature of this movie is the scene where the camera is like panning like far away, and it's on the football field, and it's just like slow-moing up to the character of Jonas, whose father is played by the voice of Patrick Starr.
Really?
That was my reaction too. I was like, the more you know.
Man, and here I thought I was like the expert on Jennifer's body. Clearly not.
You just got smashed.
I have seen enough SpongeBob in my day, and if you guys are SpongeBob fans and would like to hear help us get mental health resources into schools, patreon.com/victims and villains. We have a SpongeBob podcast on there. It is exclusive to Patreon supporters. Just throwing that out there. But no, Jonas is like, it just like a slow-mo through the field to him, and it's like set to this like super heavy breakdown, and I was like, I don't know what this is. This is the best scene in the movie, though.
Mm-hmm. The soundtrack was amazing, and the scenes where all of their posters were on the wall and like all crooked. Yes. It was like Motion City soundtrack. Like Fall Out Boy. I was like, yeah, story of the year. I had that poster. Yes. I feel so included.
I have this soundtrack, by the way, on CD that I still listen to in my car.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the soundtrack.
I might need
a great one.
Might need to pick that up for you, but to pick that up as well. To go back though to this movie and its influence of kind of, you know, with the Me Too stuff that's like woven into this. This movie was ahead of its time because I feel like, you know, here you have this band Low Shoulder that we can talk about later. Adam-brody plays, you know, pretty much plays the same role in this that he plays in Promising Young Woman, another podcast that's bound to be coming later down the pipeline. But anyways, here you have this band that they are trying to, you know, make a sacrifice to the devil to become rich and famous. But, you know, then she finds out she's, you know, it's like, oh, it's got to be a virgin. Well, she's not a virgin, and then, you know, because she's not a virgin, she turns into this succubus of sorts, and she really just, you know, starts to kind of destroy the stereotypes of the power of men. She learns to really fight back, and that's why I think that, you know, someone as a male, and being the only male voice on this podcast, I've really appreciated kind of growing up in a time, or maturing in a time, where Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter and, you know, Stop Asian Hate is such a predominant voice on social media, because it has made me really reconsider a lot of the societal norms that I grew up around. And I think that's mainly one of the reasons I didn't like this movie the first time around. But this movie was so ahead of its time in the fact that it put a major stars with Amanda-Seyfried and you know, Megan Fox, who at the time was just a goddess, a sex symbol. And, you know, you have that, and then you're expecting this like super sexualized version, and you have a female that's fighting back. And that is, you know, it was done 9 years before, you know, Jamie Lee Curtis picked up a gun and fought back against Michael Myers. And, you know, we're starting to see a lot of these stories being told, but Jennifer's Body was at the forefront, and it's an important film for that reason.
Well, it's also interesting because going back to the whole Low Shoulder aspect, I was a girl who was like in the scene, quote unquote, and it really was ahead of its time because like you don't see how problematic, honestly, music like that cannot, like the music itself, but that band culture, you know, like going back to the deep dive, all of this was based on an event that actually happened in the 90s of a band trying to sacrifice a girl to gain popularity. And, you know, growing up in the quote unquote scene and having bands like Lost Prophets and Brand New, and, you know, like all of this stuff is happening with, you know, the over sexualization of virginity and, you know, purity. And it's again, like, I feel like watching it now, I gain so much more access than I would have back then, because these are things that I didn't really notice or know of. And I mean, it can be truly a problematic culture.
That waterfall, by the way, where they sacrifice her, didn't realize it was a real place until I moved to Minnesota.
Horrifying. Horrifying.
It is a real place that you can go to. And that, I mean, that was, yeah, this is one of those movies too, where I feel like every time you watch it, you see and notice more things like hidden within, like in terms of like the music, like you mentioned, Abigail. I think it's brilliant, like that you see the evolution of Low Shoulders' career. Like you see them playing in like the shitty bar at the beginning. I mean, they even say, they're like, oh, we're playing in like, we don't even know the name of the town that we're playing in.
Yeah.
And then you see them rising to fame. And then by the end of the movie, they're playing their music in her like isolation cell when she's sent to prison as like torture. And I mean, it really is interesting, like how they weave so much throughout this movie. And like beyond seeing a woman like fight back, I also think it's a really interesting take on female friendships, especially like the first line of the movie, because I know this offhand, is hell is a teenage girl. And it really is. This is one of those movies that I recommend to people as like, this is a very, demons aside, a very accurate look at what female friendships look like. There's love, but there's also like this toxic comparing yourself to one another that still exists today. I mean, I'm turning 30 in a couple weeks, and it's still very much relevant as whether you're 15 or 30 or, 70. So there's so much I think about this movie that will have lasting impact in the next 10, 20, 30 years beyond. Like, this is one that I want to see being shown in like film classes and everything, just to talk about all the layers.
Yeah, well, what was the line about the sandbox love?
Sandbox love never dies.
Yeah, like it's again, like I was really relieved again to see this character Needy, because one, hi, it's me, but two, like just her name alone, like let's deep dive further into it. She was a more emotionally in tune person, and it really kind of reflects on, the needs of a person. If, in that high school age, if you aren't a sexy girl, no one's really going to listen to you. And that's kind of like what they were showing is it's like, here's this girl who's highly in tune to her emotions, but, she's not like the sexiest girl on the block, but her best friend is, and everyone's just kind of like, you need help. You're being over dramatic.
Yeah, her identity is being Jennifer's friend, like in high school. It's not you're a person, it's you're this person's friend, which I think is so relevant for so many people, to like not know who you are or what your place is in the world, again, whether you're in high school or well beyond. And so to see not only Jennifer fighting back, but to see eventually Needy finding her place, however misguided it might be, it's still her taking a stand and taking action.
There's a to bring it also to another film, Promising Young Woman. Look, I love that movie, so
good. It's so good.
I promise you there is an episode coming. We're holding out for something special to make that as impactful as possible, because it's such an important movie too. But there's during the climax of the movie, not giving anything away, the main character says, I wasn't sure you would remember me because I wasn't super effable. And I think Abigail, you kind of really targeted. Here you have Needy, who is kind of always glanced over because she's not sexualized, because she still wears like sweaters and button-ups, and she's the friend of the hot cheerleader that everyone wants to be with. And there's even a point in the movie where Jennifer says, I've been asked out by so many boys, you know, it's just kind of draining at this point. You know, I'm used to it, and you know, needy is just the kind of traditional, you know, archetype of, you know, the one man kind of woman that, you know, we've seen in more previous, I feel like, you know, like maybe like 50s, 60s kind of era. But her and Chip have a great relationship. It doesn't really matter. But she is often glanced over, and she's kind of taken up this identity of being kind of almost Jennifer's shadow, as Kelly was saying. And I think it's interesting the way that our society kind of depicts that, because that's such a societal thing is, you know, if you're not hot, what are you doing with your life? You know, we shame those that are not having a certain body type for being, you know, as being ugly or being different, or if you don't think the same way, then you're wrong, and you know, I don't want to talk to you, and you know, just a number of other reasons. Like, we're so negative if women don't fit a society norm is what we feel is, you know, beautiful. And I'm just kind of curious, you know, from a female lens, like how does a lot of that, you know, play with from a female viewer like you guys?
Well,
Ladies.
One of the honestly the saddest scenes for me was when Jennifer's in the van and they're like, "Oh, she's a virgin, right? Like, she's a virgin," and she knows she's not. And she's literally telling them, "Oh, yes, I am. Go find someone who's good at sex because I'm not good at sex." And so basically she's trying to sell her way out of this situation by convincing them that she won't be basically a good lay, you know? And it's that really kind of like puts in perspective of what we perceive other people to value. You know, like here's this girl fending and begging for her life, and she thinks that's what's going to get her out of a group of boys in a dangerous situation is that they're not going to be pleased with her sexually, when really if she was said like, "Oh yes, you know, like I've been sexually active for X amount of years," then they wouldn't have found interest in her. And it's like, it's that kind of reverse psychology going on. That was a very uncomfortable scene to watch as a female, because it's like, man, in that situation, what would I say? You know, what would you think that they would want?
I agree. I think that's probably like when you're talking about a movie where you have a teenage girl that's literally mauling people to death and eating out all of their body parts. That is probably the most terrifying scene to me as a woman, is watching not only Jennifer get into this van with this group of guys, but also that there's like a 10-second slow motion where it's just between her and Needy, like looking at each other through the van as she's sitting there. And you know, watching it, you're like, this is it. That you're never going to see this version of this woman again. Like, what? No matter what happens in that van, she will always be changed. And that is so real. I mean, we're taught from a very early age, regardless of your gender, to not get into cars with strangers. And that adding a layer to being a teenage girl, that definitely, it really hits you as a female viewer. It really hits close to home.
Yeah. Like what you were saying, watching that door close, like I am a rape survivor. And so watching that scene, like it really has this whole other aspect to it of like, that is the last time you're going to see that version of her. Like, no matter what happens, whether she come back alive or not, she's not really coming back alive from that situation. And so, yeah, she is transferred into like this succubus demon, what have you. But I mean, really, it just tells this whole other story of how she's just transforming into a different being from this assault. So yeah, that I agree with that.
I talked about this in my review for Promising Young Woman. Like, sorry, I keep coming back to
wrong
that.
podcast.
And I've touched about it on here a little bit of times, but I had family members that were raped, and so my sister and I were raised around a culture that was, you know, warning signs constantly, and now, you know, doing victims for now 5 years, it has been ingrained into me that I want to tell stories and give the platform, because these are important issues, and you don't want to be so flippant with it, like you guys are saying, like you ladies are saying. Once that van, once you come back out, it's an experience that you're never going to ever be the same from. And this film has a dual narrative that is about like changing, and it's about something also too on the flip side. You also have this traumatic experience with Jennifer, but then very early in the film you have the burning of Melody Lane, where you have this entire small town that is just now grief stricken, and then you have Jonas and all of the murders that are happening by the hand of Jennifer, and you have this theme of grief that's woven in. And one of the things that Jennifer says in the movie to Needy is, it's been a week, just kind of get over it. And one of the things that Abigail and I were talking about as we were kind of preparing show notes for this is, can grief actually have an expiration date, or should it have an expiration date? I think that there's always going to be times where you're going to have these traumatic events, and there's always going to be triggers that are going to bring that up. But grief is one of those things that's really tricky to kind of say best by dates, and so it's a touchy subject, because I feel like it's different for every person.
I totally agree with you. I've had, personally a lot of loss in the past year, and my friends have had a lot of loss in the past year, and I do counseling, and so I experience a lot of loss with my clients. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is grief, and how like grief is kind of the way our society sees grief is just this thing you get through. Like it's a passageway, it's a door. Like either you're on one side of it or you're on the other side of it. And the way I talk about grief is, I think about grief as like a vacancy. It's like a ever shifting like being, it's constantly like this thing that's filling a void, or, making you feel better, making you feel worse. And there really is no getting through grief. I never feel like there is no like flag on the, like Mario flag on the other hand that you like slide that, like it doesn't exist. And so like watching this, and then also knowing that the whole Melody Lane tragedy, again, looking into it, the Great White tragedy that happened in 2003, or maybe 2003, 2004, where, it was an underground band and they're performing and their pyrotechnics went off and the whole thing went down, and people were trampled and people passed away. And it was basically just the same thing. And I found it really kind of fascinating in this movie that, they touched on two massive sorts of tragedies, like you were saying, Josh, and really you can go like multiple avenues in this movie. And I feel like depending on where you're at when you watch this movie, you'll go down that avenue with it. Kind of like a choose your own adventure movie.
I'm with you. I'm sorry. I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at the scary Jennifer Spotty background that Josh just added behind
the
him.
Spirit moved him.
But in talking about grief, I'm always really interested to see, whether it's in a movie or, even a romance novel that I'm reading, just sort of like how grief is characterized. Because I completely understand what you're saying, Abigail. I feel like grief is usually, it's more of a character itself. And at least I feel like it should be. And when it's not, it's not. But I don't think grief is something that like follows you. Like, I don't think you ever necessarily get over things. Like you might compartmentalize them or put them away. But I don't think there should ever be this expectation that every single person has to experience grief the exact same way in the exact same amount of time. We can't do that with anything else. So why grief? We can't do that with love. I mean, it's the opposite. So, I it's so unrealistic to expect somebody to get over something especially as massive as what they're experiencing in this movie in the span of a week.
Mm-hmm. And it is really interesting, like with love, you know, for some reason when people are like hurting with love, we're like, oh, that's normal. Like, write a song about it, make a movie about it, do this about it, let's talk about it. And then when it's grief, we're just like, oh, it's been a week, we're over it. Like, we're done now. We're done being sad now. Let's just. Well, because it's uncomfortable.
When you talk about love, the way to get over love or loss of love is to fall in love with somebody else. It's that whole through line again. It's like we have to go from one to the next to the next to the next. Like sometimes we just need to step back. And even if you start a new relationship with somebody or you lose somebody, that doesn't necessarily erase the memories of or the love that you had with somebody else. So anyway, I feel like it's a whole different layer.
Well, touching on the love aspect, so I was researching succubuses, succubeast. But apparently, if they obviously feed on flesh, and if they were to have sexual intercourse with a person, that would take their life away. But if they were to have sexual intercourse with their true love, they live. And I read that and I was like, what about that scene where she goes in to, like, you know, be with Needy? It's like,
Interesting.
Sandbox love never dies.
Sandbox love.
If you or someone you know is listening to this podcast right now and you're struggling with suicide, addiction, self-harm, or depression, we encourage you guys to please reach out. This is the heartbeat of why we do what we do. Suicide is currently the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, and as of this recording, there are 132 suicides that take place each and every day on American soil. And when you scale back internationally, there are 800,000 successful suicides. That is one death roughly every 40 seconds. So if you or someone you know is struggling, you guys can go to victimsandvillains.net/hope. That resource is going to be right in the description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this. There you'll find resources that include the National Suicide Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. You can also text HELP to 741-741. We also have a plethora of other resources, including churches, getting connected with counselors, LGBT resources like the Trevor Project, and also veteran hotline as well. Please, if you hear nothing else in the show, understand that you listening to this right now, have value and worth. We get it. Suicide, depression, mental health, these are hard topics, and the stigma around them doesn't make it any easier. But please consider the resources right in the descriptions below wherever you guys are listening, because once again, you have value and you have worth. So please stay with us. I think I want to get that tattooed on me at some point.
It's like some people do Goonies never say die. Some people like Sandbox love night. There's two types of people.
No, I mean to your point though, Kelly, I think that, you know, grief is one of those things that we are always going to have in the corner of it. It's a different thing to process grief and, like, you know, do it healthy, but then also to kind of like unhealthily like obsess over it. And we also too, like, we have these like two societal norms where you're talking about men and women and how we process emotions and mental health, and it's just a dangerous place to be in because no one likes to be around someone else when they're sad. Like, it's uncomfortable. And, you know, I think a lot of that comes from the fact of grief kind of gets grouped into that. And so we need to find a way to just be open and to, like, be vulnerable with one another and have uncomfortable, because I was listening to this podcast today, and This is the podcast I was texting you about, Abigail.
Okay.
To all of our listeners, this is not a paid advertisement, but if you grew up with iCarly, Jeanette McCarthy, I think is her last name, the chick who played Sam, she has a new podcast out called Empty Inside, and it deals with a whole lot of like things that we talk about here, with whether it's trauma or eating disorders or grief, mental health stigmas. And one of the things that she was talking about in the mental health stigma episode was just getting out in front of it and talking about it. And I think, coming up, and I don't know where either you guys are, but one of the things that I've been doing in my own personal journey as a man of God has been to kind of redefine the way that I look and interact with other people in the faith, where it's like, the Bible talks about how we're supposed to mourn together and rejoice together. And what is that mourning looking like? It means listening to someone else and actually being vulnerable and creating a culture of saying, this is a safe place to be vulnerable and to talk with it. And, Needy's narration at one point early in the film, she actually talks about most of us were too numb to move on. And another thing that I laughed at the way that it was phrased, but it demonstrates the way that we as a society, we obsess over a tragedy, is when she calls out and talks about her, quote, tragedy boner, end quote. But, we obsess over true crime. Again, it goes back to, communicating and allowing that grief to have its spot, because to us it's just stories, but to the people that are going through it, it's tragedies, it's loss of life, it's actually has implications that we're just not seeing. Well,
I'm as well as being a counselor, I'm also a true crime junkie, so I'm like on both sides of the railroad here. But I feel like the uprise and people talking about, do I agree with how they're talking about it? Not necessarily, but like how people are talking about true crime stuff and making it more accessible is because there is this, movement happening of people being more vulnerable about things happening. And, the tragedy boner thing, like it is a thing that, sometimes I watch from a distance. I'm just like, make this stop happening. But the vulnerability aspect of it, where I feel like people are realizing like so much has been mashed down into like these boxes and it hasn't really been felt yet. And it's going to be a process of people learning how to feel it appropriately and properly, if that makes sense. But I agree with what you're saying, where I feel like vulnerability should be normalized. We have this idea of like, oh, strong people aren't vulnerable people, when really it's the opposite.
Vulnerability being a sign of weakness, it needs to go. And it's something that we've seen for so many years, like in movies, TV, books. It's just, I'm so done with it. And it's just, it needs to be okay to cry. We need to be okay to yell and scream and, get together with people and show our emotions and everything. And so it is interesting seeing how people process grief and the tragedy boner. What a great term, though. I do.
I'm sitting here thinking about it, and I'm just like, that's actually a genius way. That's genius wordsmithing.
But okay, so this is okay. Granted, as somebody who's never had a boner, but I'm like thinking like, okay, there's like when you think of a boner, there's like there's like the sexual arousal, but then correct me if I'm wrong, because this is, again, never had one. But isn't there also just sort of like, it's like a reaction? Like it's not even something that you're like planning. It just like happened. And I feel like in that regards, that's how, as somebody who loves true crime and mysteries and watching documentaries about serial killers, like for me, it's more of like, I just have this reaction to it that I want to understand. I want to understand why something like this would happen. And like, I guess that's my tragedy boner, but I can't speak for anybody else.
Yeah. So boners are cool, but have you ever had a have you ever had a toner?
What?
Have
you ever had a toner?
Is that you putting the two words together? Is that what we're doing? I don't know what we're doing.
It's a musical. It's a musical boner. It's from Pitch Perfect.
From Pitch Perfect. Okay, Nope, I'm there. I caught up. It took a while, but I got there.
I was probably watching a serial killer documentary, and you guys were watching that, so I did not catch on. I was just like, it was like a train crash. I was just like, oh no, what's happening?
It's a toner.
It's not a toner. It's my dick. I have seen that movie.
For coming to this podcast.
I have seen that movie way too many times.
Another good one.
It's one of my wife and I's favorite movies to watch, like for our own mental health decompression. But coming back to the conversation at hand with the way that we embrace tragedy. And normalizing the stigma around it. One of the things that it's so weird to be a man and have this conversation, because it's like, you know, men don't like to talk about their feelings or their emotions, and my wife can attest that I have times where like I'll bottle it up, but like 9 times out of 10 I'm like, I want to tell you what's wrong, and you're gonna hear about it.
Good.
I'm just like, yes.
Yes. I know, really, honestly, you deserve a round of applause for that.
And one of the things that, you know, we do with our writers and our podcasters here is that we're like, look, we're going to talk about mental health, because I need to know that your guys are in a good place to reach others and to write about mental health. And if you're in a dangerous place, then we need to step back and assess how do we make improvements? You know, what's going on? You know, do you need to talk about something? Do you need links to a counselor? Do you need to call the suicide prevention hotline? You know, God forbid, you know, it ever reaches that point. But normalizing things like mental health, grief, sexual assaults, like these things are uncomfortable. Like you talked earlier, Abigail, about the scene where Needy watches Jennifer get in the van. Mm-hmm. It is an uncomfortable scene. Being a male and having never gone or never endured anything that you've gone through or any of your experiences, it's still uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how someone can just watch this and just be like, oh yeah, gangbang's about to go on. Like no, that's not what I want to see. Like, I am uncomfortable. Even the scene where they're getting ready to sacrifice her is uncomfortable because she's begging for her life. And it's kind of almost, and we wrote this in the notes, it's the equivalent of like an occultic assault. You know, it's basically an occult rape that we see and witness. These guys just don't care because they're so focused on themselves and so focused on their needs and their desires and their dreams.
Well, one of the things that I do love so much about being in victims is, you know, that everyone does check up on each other. And that's one of my biggest complaints, honestly, about counseling and counseling culture is that, like, for some reason that's not normalized. Like checking up on other people in counseling and mental health isn't normalized because there's this thought of like, oh, if you're doing mental health counseling or you're working in mental health, then you should be good. You know, like yesterday I was getting my vaccine yesterday and whoop, whoop. And I was talking with the nurse because I was horrified, bless her heart. And she was asking me what I did for a living. And I told her and she was like, wow, that's so amazing that, you know, you can go through all of that and still want to help people. And I was just sitting there scratching my head like, well, that's how you get in front of it. You know, like we should stop chasing this. We should try and get in front of it, and someone has to get in front of it. you know, so the normalizing that vulnerability is what does that.
There's a line from Zack Snyder's Justice League that I just want to interject here. They're all trying to like figure out in context. They're all trying to figure out a plan to beat the big bad villain of this movie. And Bruce basically says, you know, that's not a plan for victory. That's just losing slowly. And I think that, like you said, like getting out in front of it and kind of wearing your heart on your sleeve and sharing your story and talking about your experiences with grief, mental health, sexual assault, you know, whatever circumstances that you have endured that have made you the person that you are today, that is how you win in the end. And sometimes that's not always how the story goes. You know, sometimes the story goes, you know, you're sharing it, opens up triggers that you weren't ready for. It opens up wounds that you weren't ready to be salted, and you have to go see a counselor. You have to go see a therapist until, you know, you bring restoration back to yourself. A family member that I previously mentioned that went through a rape, the first time that they talked about it, they had to go to therapy, and that first therapy session led to a suicide attempt. Mm-hmm. But over the years, they have been more vocal about it, and they've talked about it more, and they've talked about their struggles with, you know, coping negatively through drugs and alcohol, and how that didn't end up working, and how things like therapy and marriage have ultimately end up making the difference. But they went through, I think it was like almost like 20 to 25 years of just silence and just bottling that up. And, you know, that tragedy and that trauma is because we don't normalize things that need to be normalized. We all go through mental health struggles. We all go through sadness. We all go through, you know, different experiences. Some are more extreme than others, but they're uncomfortable to talk about because we as a society have deemed them uncomfortable to talk about.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, they're going back to the needy situation, you know, and everyone just calling her crazy and that she needs help. It kind of exemplifies how a lot of people, like, there's this mindset of like, people want you to be okay, not for you to be okay, but because it's uncomfortable for you to not be okay around them, you know? And so it's like, there's this falsified push of like, oh, get help, but I don't want to help you. You know, oh, get help by someone else, but come back when you're, you know, more tolerable, basically. Like, I mean, really, that's
what does that mean? You know, I mean,
exactly.
That's so bad. I took a class during grad school called Psychotic Women in Horror Films, and it was
what?
Yeah, no, it was so fantastic. Honestly, I'm gonna look back and see if I can find the syllabus and like share it with you, because 9 times out of 10, the movies we watched and discussed, it was more of a question of, well, are these women, you know, for lack of a better word, crazy, or is this like what they've been labeled? Like, are they a product of the society that they're in? Are they being treated one way, and that's why they're acting out in response? And it was a really interesting course, just in terms of discussing sort of like the very strict parameters that we put women into, and like all of the expectations placed on them. And when you don't fit those expectations, that all of a sudden you're crazy, you're you know, you're a whore, I mean, there's so many different names that we call women when they don't fit into that picture perfect box. Yeah. And this is a movie that I think would be perfect for that class, like, because there's so much to say in terms of that, both for Jennifer and for Needy.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. The first thing I wrote for victims, it took me like a month and a half, because 1, it takes me a really long time to write things, and 2, I hate ghost children, was the the orphanage. No, seriously, I would like be sitting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, be scrolling like, look, and I would see like a ghost children child would pop up. The worst. I'm like sweating thinking about it. But no, like the main character in that movie, you know, she goes through tons and tons of grief, and a lot of people watch that movie, and with the main character, they're like, oh my god, she's so crazy. How could she like raise children? And it's like, imagine if you went through that, you know, like it's so interesting how we compartmentalize women of like once they become intolerable with like their feelings, and it's like, oh, you're a whore, you're, you know, crazy.
It's
I want to take that class. Like,
I know. And you know what? The professor, she really makes like horror movies. That's basically like her go-to. And it's really interesting. It was one of those classes that I never saw myself taking, but it like popped up and I was like, yeah, why not? And it's probably one of my favorite courses that I've ever taken.
As long as there's no ghost children, like then I'm like, I will be, you will just hear like me zipping up my bag and just walking out the door.
Just a door closes as the ghost children, as the ghost child leaves the frame. Oh, Abigail left again.
It's just Abigail's left the chat. Like,
She's gone.
She's gone. She's left the team.
I think for me as a cinephile, one of the things that I have really grown to hate about revisiting older films, and I'm talking about like the 50s and below, it's just kind of been the depiction of women. When we, a couple years ago, covered, no, it was last year, and just 2020 feels like such a decade in and of itself. The Invisible Man, I went and back and revisited the original Invisible Man, and I'm like, man, this is such a good movie, except the depiction of women. And rewatching King Kong in anticipation for Godzilla versus Kong is like women again being such an issue. And then you get to 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and one of the very last shots in that film is Sally just in the back of a pickup truck, just blood soaked, laughing and crying hysterically. And I think it's one of the most real depictions of women who have undergone traumatic events that's ever been set to because, you know, most times we see women acting hysterical, but we never see the aftermath. And I would say with the exception to you know, the relationship between the original Nightmare and Nightmare 3, you get to see Nancy's kind of evolution and how she's dealt with this stuff of, you know, Freddy Krueger and but Sidney Prescott, I would say, from Scream is kind of arguably the poster child for, you know, what it looks like to really see an evolving process of grief and PTSD and trauma take place on the screen. And even here in 2021, I still feel like we don't really kind of give women the chance to process these emotions properly because we still are fitting into these societal norms.
That's a really interesting point, and I hadn't really thought about that. But now that I am thinking about it, that is really interesting, especially when you consider, at least in my mind, the most memorable of horror movies, the ones who usually make it out at the end is a single woman. I mean, a lot of survivors at the end of horror movies is the one woman left standing.
That is the final girl trope.
Mm-hmm.
And if you guys have never heard of the final girl trope, it was back in like the early 80s when like the slasher boom was really starting to take shape. There was an author that wrote in a book basically kind of like just picking the genre of horror apart, and he coined that term, or she, I can't remember who wrote it, the book, but Heather coined the term final girl, and it basically means it's like last girl standing, like you were just talking about, Kelly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I never really, it's not something that I think about, but I guess when looking back on like a lot of the horror movies that I love, especially ones that are huge franchises as well, like it really does leave us off with a single girl left behind.
Well, what was that? It was a few years ago, the quote unquote horror movie. I mean, it was a horror movie, but it was kind of one of those, you know, campy ones where she's like with her not her new family, her like fiance's or husband's family, and they like play a game for like survival, and she has to hide like in the house.
Is that Ready or Not?
Ready or Not. So basically all I'm hearing from this is that the way women have to, okay, take notes. The way women have to process things is be laughing and crying covered in blood. And that's what we have
hysterical.
to do.
I mean, it's right back to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, hysterical in the back of a truck. By the way, that is one of the best horror movies in like the last 10, 15 years. So good.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you. I've watched that a lot.
Same.
I've been like, get it, girl. Get it. It makes me feel so free.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we're bringing it back to, people making sacrifices to the devil here.
Didn't even think about that.
So Abigail, you wrote this in your notes that something that I didn't even consider was the abilities that Jennifer actually obtains after the sacrifice and turning into the succubus, and subsequently also Needy getting bitten by Jennifer at the end. And you had kind of alluded to it being an allegory for like, women being equal to men, or, elevating to quote, people's like level of power. And I think that's a really interesting depiction of something that I missed and didn't even really dawn on me.
Well, I was left there in the pool scene, and I'm just sitting there like, okay, why is this girl float? Like, there has to be some. What am I missing? There has to be something. And so I thought about it for a second, and I was like, wow, like every time this girl's levitating around and gets like her super strength going on, it's when she feels the most insecure. And and that just made me real, because later on in the movie when Needy gets some of these powers, it's because she needs to basically rise up to an event in her life. And so I mean, whether or not be accurate, I'm not sure. It makes me sleep better at night thinking about that than like Jennifer just levitating for no reason. Like,
well, and if you think about, there's the moment we see Jennifer levitate in the pool, and she's hovering, levitating. She's not flying.
Not like she's hovering.
That's very clear. We see Needy, hovering, levitating, whatever you want to call it, at the end. And then the really cool thing for me is that the scene where Needy like confronts Jennifer and eventually kills her in her own bed, you see literally a transfer of power. Like, I mean, you see Jennifer on top of her, you see them rolling around in the air, you see Jennifer biting her, thus transferring basically what she has to Needy. And it's the last straw before Needy, rips her Biff necklace off, BFF necklace off, and that's like the breaking point, because that's like the last thing holding them together. It's like I said, you can really analyze this movie. Like, if you want to just watch it for like a good time, that's there, but there's so many layers to this movie.
Yeah, they're like, that's what I was saying before. It's like it's depending on how much like gas you have in your tank, like you can go far with this movie. Like, you can just drive around the block and be like, it's entertaining. Like, we're Biffs, like the one-liners, the slippery squirrel one-liner. Like, I literally had to pause and take a moment.
Where's it at, monostat?
That's why we're Biffs. But or you can put more mileage in it and like go and write thesis papers, apparently, which
I might still do it, honestly. Yeah. Like, I might just do it.
Just give me that teacher's name and I'll just like email her a paper. Just I was never your student. I'm never going to attend your class. Here's a thesis paper on Jennifer's body.
One of the things that I was to go off of what you guys were just talking about, before we started this, I was watching the movie Spree, that stars Stranger Things' Joe Carey, and it's a movie that is like I love the way Collider put it. It's American Psycho for the digital age. And you follow this character, Kurt, throughout the course of this film, and you just kind of see about how much, he's just chasing the Instagram, and like, he wants to be this like influencer. And I feel like when you look at, who is a influencer in our social age, and it's these women that are just just like goddesses, basically.
Incredibly beautiful.
Yeah. And they have like the right curves, and they have the just the right outfits on at the same time. They're showing just the right amount of cleavage, and this is how they're garnishing stuff. And I've often struggled with this, if I can be vulnerable, it's like, I feel like a couple years ago I was like, why do I feel like I'm just like screaming repetitively into a pillow? Here we are trying to just tell people about their value and their worth, and here you have people that are selling Bang Energy in nothing but a bikini, and yet they're reaching 500,000 people a day. And it kind of blows my mind, but I've gotten away from that. But I think to some degrees, I think that this film, with that transfer of power, is a great allegory for how we treat women. If women want to have power over men, it's always depicted as, you have to be really sexualized, you have to be over sexualized in some sense. And you see the way that when Jennifer is at her strongest, it is when she is beautiful. It is when her hair's, as Needy says, gorgeous. And
such a great addition. Like, I was like on the edge of my seat, but how's her hair look though? And then Needy answered, I was like, oh, okay, good. Tight.
She doesn't look like she's like dying almost. There's a couple of scenes where she does look like she's dying, and my wife, I'm not only the only man on this podcast, I'm also the only married person on this podcast, and I've been married for 7 years at this point, and my wife, every time before we go out, she's like, basically like, oh, I gotta make sure my makeup's on so I look alive. And I'm like, I don't understand, but
does not compute. What's interesting too is when she's at her most like vulnerable, weakest state, and she is like visibly like her skin's kind of breaking out and her hair's like a little oily. Oh my gosh, the thing that Needy says to her is, like, to me, one of the worst things you can say to a person, which is, you know what? You look really tired today.
Oh my.
And I just was like, oh my God. Like, she didn't even have to tell her, you look bad, or like, your skin's not looking its best. It's just, you look really tired.
Oh, that's like the worst. I would get that all the time. I used to work 12-hour shifts on a psych unit, and so there were definitely some days, like after the fourth day in a row, I'd come in like not banging, not my best. And the clients would be like, are you sick? but no, well, honestly, I maybe this is just me, like when Megan Fox was the most dressed down, like I remember even specifically looking over to my fiance and being like, I think she looks really hot right now.
She's got that grunge thing going on.
He just looked at me and he was like, that's because you like dead girls. And I was like, okay, whoa. I can just relate to that look. That's the only thing. But no, like that was a really interesting part of it, is like, you would think that Needy would be a little more like affectionate and caring in like her delivery of that line. But it just kind of shows that she even like put her on this pedestal of sexuality, of like, oh, well, this is how she's, sorry, I have a phone call. This is how she's supposed to be looking. She's supposed to be sexy and hot and beautiful and whatever. And it even just makes you think like, well, does Needy love her for her? or like it.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of a strange twist.
Yeah, and it also goes back to the way that we view what beauty can be named, or how it's supposed to be viewed. And Hulu had a great documentary years ago called Rethinking Barbie that was documenting Barbie's long struggle to, being more than just this bleach blonde hair with, big tits and, just, being the all-American housewife and the picture of perfection that, is unrealistic to sell to young girls. And it's only within the last 10 years that Barbie as a company, Mattel, has started to make other lines of
I mean, there's different body sizes, there's different ethnicities now,
dolls.
and they've done a great job, but let's be honest, there's still a long way to go. Crayola just released that skin tone crayon line last year.
Yeah. And can I just tell you, where was it the other day? I was in Target because may have been looking for those tiny brands. I might be the collector of those little tiny brands things. I might do that. But
spoiler alert, she is.
Yes, that is my healthy coping hobby now. I'm clean, but I do that. So I was going down the Barbie line, and there's this like My Life like line, and it's like the off brand of Barbie, and there's like athlete. Like My Life as an athlete, and there's this boy, like you could tell he was like a stud, and then My Life as a ballerina, and she was just like had this cute little leotard. Kid you not, there was My Life as a second language teacher, and she had glasses, she had a plaid skirt with like leggings and like this cart. She looked dowdy for like a 7-year-old, and it was just like, so that's what like My Life as an educated woman is.
That's also like really specific, like language teacher, like
and then they had My Life as a pony, and it was a horse. So like the whole thing was just all over the place.
This is what we get to choose from: athlete, second language teacher, unicorn.
It was just a horse.
Ballerina.
It was just a horse.
How would you guys like to help us get mental health resources into schools, conventions, and other events? Well, now you can. Simply go to patreon.com/victims and villains for as little as $1 a month. You guys can help us get mental health resources into current and upcoming generations, educate and break down stigma surrounding mental health, suicide, and depression. And you get exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else. And you guys can tell us which Nicolas Cage movie you want us to cover, and we'll do it. All it takes to get started is to go to patreon.com/victims and villains, or simply click the link in the episode description wherever you guys are currently listening or streaming this episode. Pick your tier and get started today. Yes, it's that simple. So quickly select the tier that you want and help us get hope into the hands of the depressed and the suicidal today.
But yeah, the tropes for what we can aspire to, and it's like my fiance, like bless his heart, he hasn't experienced like a fraction of like the traumatic experiences I have, and good for him. Like I applaud that. But there are some times where we're like in a store and we see something like that, or we're watching a movie, or someone says something to us, and he'll look at me and he's like, "Really? Like, is that something you experience?" And I'm just like, yeah, that's a thing. Like, I'm never comfortable walking at night. Like, I'm sorry that street light's out and you don't feel comfortable walking at night, but I never feel comfortable walking at night.
No.
Just there's just a whole thing that just doesn't get addressed.
And what I do appreciate though is, people like your fiance and Josh, like they're taking the steps to want to listen and learn. And, obviously we can never share the exact same experiences, but, I have one of my best girlfriends asked me the other day, she's like, "Hey, I'm going to watch Promising Young Woman, and then I need to binge watch Handmaid's Tale before the new season comes out. Is this something that my husband will like? And I was like, it's something that your husband should watch. I don't know if he'll like it, but I think that this is something that you should watch. And bonus, if you watch it together, because I guarantee he's going to have questions to ask while you're watching them. And she's like, good, that's exactly the answer I needed. And I'm going to have him watch it with me for that very reason.
And then he sent you an angry letter.
Not yet.
But dear Kelly, I do not appreciate this movie review. This movie suggestion sucks.
Oh.
If they need to, you can give them my email, and I will tell them politely why Promising Young Woman needs to be viewed by every male. And
everybody.
Again, that episode is coming, but to also kind of come back to the beauty and how our culture perceives it. There's a scene very early on where they're at the Melody Lane, and Jennifer, grabs Needy's lady bits, and she says, "These are smart bombs. You point them in the right direction, and boom." And my wife and I were jokingly having a conversation about this a couple months ago, where it's like, why are guys so attracted to boobs?
Oh my gosh. I ask myself this every day. Like,
well, it's one of those things where the more you think about it, the more like disturbing it is.
Yeah, and then it's like a mommy thing. Like the more you think about it with like milk, and you're just like, no, I need to back away.
I'm just gonna close this door. I would not want to look in there. Yeah, no, it's something. I actually had one of my kiddos was talking to me about that last year. This like uncomfortable interaction she had, and that's something we were talking about. Where it's like, what is the fantasy and like sexualization with that? Because really, if you break it down with anatomy, there's nothing magical. They're like going back to the unicorns. There's no unicorn magic going on there. Like it really should just be the same, And if you consider like how if I walked outside topless right now, like I would be arrested. But my fiance can, and it's just my intention, it's like intention versus impact. Like if my intention is not to be sexual, then your impact should not be sexuality. There's a lot going on.
a lot happens that viewers or listeners cannot see right now. And I'm sorry.
Them.
Well,
I'm sorry that you guys had to see that.
I did not. That was not a sexual impact because that was not a sexual intention.
There you go.
No.
There you go.
No.
Bam, 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 bam.
This is all comedy. From a male gaze though, like if I honestly don't even understand it myself, because when my wife asked me that, I was like, honestly, like I don't know. Like I've always been, I think as a guy, it's always kind of been locker room talk. It's always been boiled down to breasts or, the butt. And those are the two areas that kind of get talked about. And somewhere along the lines, I think it's just something that I have, just picked up. And now being with the same person for 10 years, like it's one of those things that's like, I'm with my wife for the rest of my life, like till death do us part. Like I mean those words, and marriage is not something that I take lightly, and I want to make sure that I'm understanding, I'm unlearning, like why do I have this why are boobs such a fascination to me as a 30-year-old man, feeling like a 10-year-old going through puberty for the first time. And I think I think it's something that, jokes aside, I think it's something that all guys kind of go through, and it's...
Did they give you a toner?
They do not. But that Jonas camera scene did.
You know what, though? It is funny, because, like, I know when I was, like, first coming into my body, and, like, I had, like, very small boobs. I mean, I feel like everybody does at one point, but I just remember somebody telling me like, oh, well, that's not bad because like, you know, boobs are mostly fat. And I'm like, okay, so now that I have like bigger breasts and like a big ass, it's like those are the parts that are like the most attractive to men. Do they know that they're attracted to mostly fat? Because why are we painting fat women to be not attractive in this culture when we got lots of extra junk in the trunk going on?
Double whammy right there. That's just a oxymoron that really cancels each other out. That like it's like this is a paradox that you're setting up for beauty, because in some sense you're saying like thin women are attractive, and like this is like the, you know, to go back to Barbie, like this is the depiction of what beauty is, and now you're saying curves are beautiful, but there's always that like little asterisk right next to that the latter statement with like conditions on like what makes beautiful. Like last time I checked, beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
Right. Well, and I have to say, you know, for the podcast, I interview a very wide range of people who are in and around the world of romance novels. I've talked to sex workers. I've talked to models. Like it's really interesting because I feel like, especially when talking to sex workers, like it's really interesting in that there's a huge majority of people who favor plus size women in terms of like the porn that they consume, and it's only when done quietly that it's okay. Like that's kind of been my take from the way that we paint plus size women in society, is like, you can be attracted to them. Chances are you probably are. However, we don't talk about it. That's not something that we talk about with our friends because they'll think you're weird, even though they probably think the same thing too.
And it is just like this weird dichotomy of like, so I'm from the South, you know, very, very conservative, you know, like unrealistically conservative South, where it's like, you know, and again, I was in like the scene group, and, you know, we were the more alternative people in our Western town. And, you know, a lot of the kids in my group, you know, that we were open about our sexualities and experimenting and whatever. And I can't tell you how many times like I've heard people shit on, especially like, you know, the football players shit on like the open lesbians in our community, the people identify as lesbian, but they're going home and watching hot lesbian porn. And it's just like, you can be a lesbian unless you're ugly, and then it's not hot. But if you're a hot lesbian, it's okay. But only if you think I'm like, it goes, I don't understand. It's, you know, going back to the tits and the butt thing. It's like, why are there only two roads here?
Well,
that doesn't make sense.
I was gonna say that goes back to the needy thing too, where you have like, if you're not this culturally subjective hot individual, then you don't have any value, or you don't have any worth. And it's like, well, I as a male would be more attracted to Amanda-Seyfried than I would Megan Fox. And
I am more attracted to Amanda-Seyfried than Megan Fox.
Well, and I mean, for me, like the man that I found myself most attracted to in this movie was the emo kid.
Oh, the emo kid. I can't even talk about it. I can't.
I love him. And the fact that he's supposed to be the one that that Megan Fox can only get with when she's at her ugliest and weakest. That was like that's the part that really gets me. Like all the people who are the quote unquote not prettiest are really the ones who have so much value in this movie, and they're the ones who are often the victims, both in the movie and also in real life.
Yeah, like my top three was, you know, needy, you know, Jennifer on her off day when she looked dead and sick, and then the emo kid.
Colin, that's his name.
Yeah, and I had an actual conversation with Brandon, my fiance. I looked at him and I was like, that would be my kid in high school. Like, there's so many feelings happening. But yeah, going back to the thin versus like fat and whatever thing, I was a very, very thin. I, you know, still am like a very slender, you know, don't have a lot going on in any on any road. But in high school it was ridiculous. I was like a pretzel stick. And there was this guy who was interested in me, and he was bullied out of being interested in me because his friend said in front of him, only dogs like bones.
Ew.
I know. So I grew up my whole life, hating myself, hating my body, hating, how slow I was, turning into a woman. And then my 20s hit, and, all these guys came back to me and they're like, oh, well, you're hot now. So now, it just, I just don't, Josh. No. I don't understand.
No, don't put me in that bubble.
Josh has left the chat.
Pop. That's the sound of the bubble being popped. Pop. All right. I think that is going to do it for us on this episode of Victims and Villains. I feel like maybe if you guys really want this, maybe we'll do a part 2 to this episode. Let us know at Victims and Villains, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. But speaking of social media, Miss Kelly Reynolds, where can people find Boobies and Newbies?
Oh, well, you can find it on anywhere you stream podcasts. I'm also on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at Boobies Podcast and boobiesandnewbies.com. I have new episodes almost every Friday. I want to say every Friday, but sometimes I'm lazy. So, yeah, it's a lot of fun. And even if you're not an avid romance reader, that's perfectly fine. There's a reason Newbies is part of the title.
True story. I've been on there. I've been exposed.
You were a great guest as well.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed our episode together.
There are discussions of possible return. We don't know yet. But and also too, Kelly does a crap ton of Instagram live videos. So you guys can also literally every time in the past week that I've gotten on, I just get a notification. Boobies Podcast has started an IGTV video.
I know, it happens. I interview a lot of authors on Instagram, and then we've started doing a book club on the last Wednesday of the month on Instagram.
Wait, this is what? Use a book club? Okay, so I'll email. Where do I email you at?
You just follow me, and I'll post about it. I put it all up on social media, and also I'm not sure when you're putting out the episode, but all April long, I'm doing this massive book giveaway. That's basically a way to celebrate my birthday all month long. So if you want to maybe take home some free books, that's happening too.
Well, if you're gonna make me, I guess. Oh.
All right. Well, you guys can find all of our stuff at victimsandvillains.net. That is going to get you guys access to our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, and Letterboxd as well. It'll get you guys movie reviews, past episodes, spin-off podcasts, including That's High Praise, a Nicolas Cage podcast, Coffee and Conversations, and much more. And more importantly, it'll also get you guys access to our mental health resource library. So the real reason why we do what we do. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of Victims and Villains. Go check out the Boobies and Newbies podcast. Links will be in the descriptions below. But we're going to go hang out with Needy and watch her levitate.
We're going to go be Biffs. Let's go be Biffs.
Let's go be Biffs.
Biffs.